This is a film about the relations between users of communication technologies and the people who make this equipment. It focuses on China, where millions of young men and women make the desktop computers, laptops, smartphones, iPads, and other gadgets that have come to be an indispensable part of today's world. China calls these workers migrant workers, as for the most part they are born and raised in the countryside and move to China's coastal cities as adults to look for work. The film asks how we, the consumers of these communication technologies, are connected to these workers' lives through markets, laws, projects, and norms. Our film tells an improbable story, the story of one particular project born from these complex connections. Though it is particular, it is also representative of the extremes to which companies, consultancies, and shareholders in the West will go to convince themselves that workers who make what we consume are being treated decently. When I first started this project, I knew about as much as anybody else. I knew that tech companies make a lot of money producing the wonderful gadgets that we all have, and that the Chinese workers who make them for us earn very little. It was by attending a meeting at the International Labour Organization that I began to see the complexity of the problems around global regulation of labor conditions in electronics. I decided to do this project with Dr. Marilène Libert, who is currently a professor of gender studies at the University of Geneva. We began our investigation by looking at the law. Does China have the legal regulations necessary to implement standards for decent work?
So when we talk about the labor condition in China, there are all the laws that are necessary. There is a whole set of laws on work condition, labor condition. What is specific is that those laws are not implemented. Local governments, they get taxes from these economic activities, and this is really important to them. So sometimes they're not really keen on implementing real labor rights.
This first point is very important. China is by no means a legal no man's land. However, it's common knowledge that their laws and regulations are not thoroughly implemented, and indeed this may be part of the reason transnational corporations are investing and sourcing in China in the first place. Global activists have been insisting for a while now that the response to this must be regulation or some form of binding norm setting at the international level. We went to meet Paul Bailey, who worked on these issues at the International Labour Organization before his retirement.
Well, when I first started in the ILO, I was in the Multinational Enterprises Department. The ILO had just adopted a tripartite declaration on multinational enterprises and social policy in 1978. The way to get these things adopted was to do them as voluntary declarations. You know, companies and employers like voluntary standards. There is a certain tendency or desire by the employers to say, let's not have more binding standards, let's have promotional activities and promote good practice for all.
Our first encounters with the ILO quickly led us from questions of hard law to questions of good practices, or so-called soft law, non-binding voluntary standards that the electronics industry proposes to apply to itself in order to guarantee decent working conditions throughout their supply chains. These norms and practices are summed up in the concept of corporate social responsibility. CSR ideally should apply to the entire production model governing an industry. Investigating working conditions in China thus meant engaging with CSR. What are its professional norms and ideals, and how do CSR professionals set out to attain them? We went to speak with Jeremy Prespkus, who works in a CSR consultancy based in Hong Kong. We wanted to know what characterized his work.
I work with great people. I work on issues that I fundamentally believe in. And when I look at my daughter's and my son's future, the questions that we're talking about will impact them. Maybe what we're doing is smoothing out some of the jagged edges that happen in the development curve. And if that's the case, and that's my career, I'm happy with that. Because those jagged edges are, from a factory perspective, health and safety and fingers and toes and wages and overtime. And that's people's lives.
While CSR professionals may be convinced that their efforts have an impact, many NGOs are less enthusiastic. We went to see Chantal Payer from Bread for All and asked her about the NGO perspective on CSR.
So if you want that companies really take CSR or human rights seriously, there needs to be laws and which oblige them to do this, and there needs to be some sanctions that if they don't take human rights seriously and they don't implement what they say, there will be some sanctions.
If you look at the world, I mean, ideally, you should have laws, and they should be applied, and they should be enforced, and there should be penalties if you don't respect them. But we don't live in an ideal world. Every country doesn't have that. So in the absence of country X ratifying a convention and enacting a law and enforcing it, why not corporate social responsibility?
We discovered that there's really kind of two camps, and often they blend. One is people who believe that CSR works even though it has limitations or think it's worth trying, and the other is people who think that it's really too limited, that there are structural contradictions built in to the model. As anthropologists and sociologists, our strategy was different. Rather than take a position in the debate about whether or not CSR works, we wanted to ask a simpler, more descriptive question. What does CSR actually do on the ground? We therefore went to visit a number of firms and their suppliers in electronics to find out how they implemented CSR in their factories. We discovered that most of the time, supplier firms outsource their CSR programs to local Chinese NGOs. The main target publics for their programs are so-called migrant workers. The question we wanted to investigate was, what do these local NGOs do for these migrant workers, and how do they conceive of their work?
也是希望说可以去让这个工业区的打工朋友也是说一种是可以丰富他们的一些生活了，那还有一种也是说借助这样一个平台，希望这个工业区呢一些环境可以有一些人跟人之间这种关系可以有一些改变了。
With these initial interviews, we began to see how CSR programs and discourses produce effects that go far beyond the question of labor standards in the industry. Indeed, CSR professionals often invent and implement what they call capacity-building programs, intentionally designed to tackle a large array of social issues beyond working conditions. Once again, as social anthropologists, we decided to follow these activities to wherever they led us, leaving behind the questions of labor rights and labor conditions, to explore what local NGOs were actually doing with the funding provided by the CSR programs they run.
So there are programs, for example, on women's health, and there are also hotlines. What they were doing is chatting with the workers. They were chatting about legal information, of course, but they were also chatting about all kinds of different things. For example, how to cope and live in a very big city far away from one home, how to deal with a relationship that is quite complicated with a boyfriend or a girlfriend.
After observing the hotlines for a while, we began to follow up on some of the programs that the hotlines produced, and one of the NGOs we worked with most closely developed a specialized hotline for parents who were concerned about issues of communicating with their children who are left behind in the villages when they come to work. Left behind children have become a major social problem in contemporary China, as parents working in cities feel they are losing contact with their children who are being raised by uncles, aunts, and grandparents back in the villages. Many Chinese NGOs are in the business of designing programs to tackle this problem. So we discussed with the woman who designed a special program for these left-behind children to see how she came to this idea and how she put a program in place and how she sold it to corporate sponsors in order to execute this form of capacity building.
所以我当时用了半年的时间去湖南那个叫湘西一个更穷的地方，然后去落地了大概1个多月的时间，去做一个调研，然后从而去发现，就是从我们在工人身上拿到了这些个案的问题，以及是结合现在很多的书本性的调研东西，是否跟我看到的是一样吗？
The NGO we worked with closely was extremely cooperative and interested, in fact, in our research, and they allowed us to follow them on one of their most ambitious programs, going to villages in a poor province in China, and talking with the kids and their caretakers in the village, and also with the schools that the kids went to, in order to put in place a whole communicative strategy revolving around a telephone.
项目操作起来的话呢，比相对于其他的项目来讲难度要更大，因为它涉及的利益相关方太多，就涉及的人太多，有工人，有学校，有 volunteer 然后也还有留守儿童，对。
Concretely, the program started with a worker calling the NGO hotline to report on a difficulty he or she was having communicating with their children back in the village. And then, with the permission from these parents, the NGO contacted these children's schools, and through the schools, the children's caretakers. They negotiated with the schools to send a young volunteer to serve as a mentor to these children. This volunteer lived in the school and was available to talk with all of the school children. He was a kind of school psychologist provided by the NGO. In addition, the volunteer was to get in touch with the family where the child was living and establish regular contacts with the child and the family. The idea was to provide a kind of safe space where children could discuss any personal difficulties they were having in school, at home, in their social lives, and presumably open up about the reasons they had for not wanting to talk with their parents. As an incentive for participation, and as a marketing strategy, no doubt, kids were given cell phones and encouraged to use them to call their parents. As you can imagine, following how this project worked on the ground involved rather intensive fieldwork with a number of partners, none of which had been briefed on who exactly we were and what we were doing there. We visited a number of schools with all sorts of surprise effects and cultural misunderstandings.
各位同学都看到了，好几个陌生的，又帅又开朗的年轻人。
He said, "We have come to help their school. The foreign guests have come to help their school, solve all of its problems."
那么大家如果有任何问题，或者是有关于这个学习的也好，或者是这个心理的都好，到时候呢，我们在下一个月会派一个驻点老师过来。那么这个老师呢会住在学校这边，还有给你们上这些比较好玩的。
One of the most noticeable things about the way the project was designed was its rhythm. We went very rapidly from one place to another. They were very efficient in their procedures, but perhaps not always paying attention to how the local people were understanding, or not, what the whole project was about and what they were there for. This is quite interesting.
What?
She's very excited about this project.
Yeah. This school is lack of teachers.
Lacks teachers.
Especially the English teacher.
So they're happy that someone will help them.
The 驻点义工 can
Help
teach
with English?
Yeah. It will be better. Here's man. Thank you.
那么主要的是来了，做这个留守儿童项目的。那我们待会儿呢会拍一支笔给大家。那么这支笔里面呢，就是有这个电话，还有 QQ。 那么大家可以通过这2个方式找到我们的热线人员。比如说你家里遇到什么紧急的麻烦，来不及拨打110的时候，可以拨打我们这个电话；或者是您跟你妈妈沟通有问题的时候，跟老师就是有冲突的时候，也可以打我们这个电话。对，那么我们可以24小时为你解决问题，好吧？那么请
现在呢，请各班的班长上来，领取。
Both the work culture that the NGO brought to this project and the content of their message were subject to misunderstandings by the local populations. Part of this was based on an assumption that these children were necessarily made unhappy by the separation from their parents. This became apparent in one moving and surprising encounter at a boarding school specially conceived for left-behind children.
一个地点的急死我操！上苹果电视。
OK， 那我们现在开始了啊。其实很简单，我们这一次来的话就是根据你的父母派我们过来这边给你做一个非常简单的一个家访的话，然后可以根据你的具体情况，那我们到时候会派一个驻点义工，就是这个支教老师，是住在这个都康中学这边的。那么都康中学他每个星期或者是1个月都会过来这边，然后如果你回家的话，他可以去到你的家里，跟你做这一个心理辅导也好，这个学习上的一些这些问题都好，都可以找他，好吧？那么你多久的？你多久跟你的妈妈联系一下？
每周吧。
每周是吧？讲的话主要是什么内容？
学习还有
学习，
还有生病没生活，
对吧？应该很少生病吧？对吧？对啊，你看就知道嘛，黑黝黝的。那平时的话，他有没有就是对你这个在学校里面玩的开不开心啊？跟这些伙伴我们玩的开不开心有问你吗？有是吧？那平时最多的话还是聊哪一块的？你跟那你
生活
是吧？那跟爸爸妈妈打电话开心吗？
开心啊！
开心啊！有没有曾经有过那么一次想要责怪他们说有没有？
没有
是吧？好孩子。那爸爸妈妈跟你讲话的时候，就有没有就是每次都是这样的话题，还是说每一次都是不一样的话题呢？
不一样。
不一样是吧？看来你妈妈很关心你哦，是吧？你还知道你妈妈就是或者爸爸出去工作的一个时间吗？
不记得。
不记得。当时
是小时候啊。
小时候是吧？小时候有没有恨过他？
没有。没有。
你对爸爸妈妈出去外面工作有什么看法？
很赞成。
很赞成。为什么赞成呢？有没有不赞成的呀？没有。哇，看来都很懂事哦。
那爸爸妈妈不是赚钱的，哪来的钱来给我读书？
你是这样子想的？OK， 那如果现在想叫你跟你爸妈说一句话的话，你最想要说什么？
你们辛苦了。
爸爸妈妈辛苦是吧？有没有另外一句啊？感动一点的啊？
好，我爱你们。
哎呦，现场都没有人鼓掌的，哎呀，不对啊！谢谢哥哥，谢谢哥哥姐姐，
谢谢哥哥姐姐，你们辛苦了。
这里的话，我们就有一个手机是需要送给你的，这个的话就是对这个手机。
谢谢。
多姐。那么谢谢。这一个手机的话呢，就只是可以发信息。
Our trip lasted an intense 2 days. We drove back over the night, and back at the NGO, we participated in the morning's debriefing about the program we had just led with Heidi and her team. Their questions had to do with their professionalism and how they could organize their procedures better to produce a package that they could sell to other firms interested in this kind of capacity building program.
那第二块的话，我可能会去讲一下为什么这些 brand 他愿意去参加这样的一个 project。 首先有一个很重要的就是，几乎所有的国际品牌他们都要做 CSR report。
In order to address pressures from international shareholders concerned about the social impact of their investments, companies are obliged to finance projects in corporate social responsibility. Chinese NGOs are then led to compete with each other in the market for attractive projects to sell to these corporations. Our questions, of course, had to do with what this particular example of a local capacity building program tells us about the broader forces at work behind corporate social responsibility in complex supply chains.
对，那当然这个 report 的一个，不管是为了他们的一个企业形象，还是说去做更多对于社会有帮助的东西，不管是出于任何原因，他们需要去拟写这样的一个 CSR report。那当然，每一个品牌他们都会有自己 focus 的群体。那当然就是每个品牌，现在大部分的品牌，他们肯定有几点会去关注，很多都会关注农村的儿童。
In listening to Heidi, we can feel this NGO's sincere desire to help out these rural populations who are sending workers to the cities. We can also see how these young urban professionals' desire to do good feeds into corporate strategies, PR strategies, directed at their investors. Stepping back to look at the big picture, we can see how far we have come by following the actors we were working with on the ground.
You have those true believers, those people that are working in those NGOs, they want to help the worker. They really truly want to help them.
We started out this research project interested in the whole concept of corporate social responsibility. And what we've discovered is that works more or less well, probably less well. But these programs produce corollary effects, secondary effects. And one of the major ones that we want to emphasize is how responsibility for labor conditions gets transformed into a question of self-development, of self-help, of capacity building. Who's building capacity? NGOs, but also workers are supposed to be building their own capacity to protect themselves. And then this shifts even further to questions of lifestyle, how you interact with your children, psychological counseling, and some sort of, in the Chinese vocabulary, civilizational mission. That is, how to train mainly rural, poor workers into becoming acceptably modern urban citizens. It's a series of little shifts that have to do with how the actors on the ground understand their work, Chinese NGOs and workers themselves, and how those needs are taken care of and transform entirely the entire message behind CSR.